Ever wonder why, in the age of memory foam mattresses, blackout curtains, and endless advice from wellness gurus, so many of us still wake up in the morning feeling shattered? We invest in ergonomic pillows, apps that monitor our breathing, even rings that claim to score our dreams. And yet, the modern world, with all its comforts, has left us exhausted. Strangely, if you had lived 600 years ago without electricity, without sleep studies, without even a concept of sleep hygiene, you might have woken refreshed in a way most of us can only envy. The irony is sharp. We call ourselves advanced, but medieval men and women, living under the stars and shadows, may have known a secret we've forgotten. That secret was not a magic potion, nor a king's luxury, but a rhythm. A rhythm so natural, so deeply human, that when scientists in the 1990s placed volunteers in cabins without artificial light, their bodies rediscovered it all on their own. The pattern is called Biphasic sleep, two distinct phases of slumber divided by a gentle waking in the middle of the night. In medieval Europe, this was not seen as unusual or disruptive. It was the way things were meant to be. First sleep began soon after nightfall and lasted about 4 hours. Then, people awoke not groggy, not resentful, but calm and alert for 1 or 2 hours before sinking back into their second sleep until dawn. Think of that moment. You stir in bed at 2 in the morning. Today, you might curse the ceiling, toss about, or reach for your glowing phone. But 600 years ago, no one would have called it insomnia. In fact, a medieval villager might have wondered why you were still in bed at all. These midnight hours were precious. They were known. They were expected. They were even treasured. Families whispered stories in the darkness. Couples spoke softly while embers glowed low in the hearth. Monks used the stillness for prayer. Bakers and craftsmen rose to check their kilns, while women threaded needles into cloth by the flame of a rushlight. To them, it was not wasted time, it was life flowing in harmony with nature. We might call it strange today, but in truth it makes sense. Our ancestors didn't see the night as a void to be slept through in one solid block. They saw it as a cycle: rest, reflection, rest again. And in that cycle was balance. This interlude between sleeps became a time for contemplation, creativity, and closeness. Imagine a medieval noblewoman, candle at her side, scratching verses of poetry on parchment, convinced that the silence of the night lent clarity to her thoughts. Imagine a merchant hunched over his accounts, declaring later that numbers never appeared so clear as in those hours. To them, the night was not an enemy to be fought, but a companion that offered a second kind of wakefulness, sharper and more peaceful than the day. This is the first great truth medieval people lived by, that being awake at midnight was not a flaw but a gift, a window into a different state of consciousness, halfway between waking and dreaming, where the mind was alert yet unburdened. In their eyes, this was as natural as the sun rising and setting. For them, the night was not broken. Only we, with our sleepless anxieties, have broken it. Once the first sleep ended, the medieval world stirred. Not loudly, not in chaos, but in a quiet hum of human activity that spread across homes, monasteries, and city streets. It was as if the world had agreed on a secret hour of waking. Bakers used the time to knead dough so that warm loaves would greet the morning. Craftsmen stepped out into the cool night to check on kilns or long, slow cooking processes, their work illuminated only by embers and the glow of rushlight's slender candles designed to last just long enough for these hours. For noble households, the midnight waking carried a gentler tone. Letters were written, poetry composed, embroidery stitched in silence while the rest of the town lay sleeping. One French noblewoman in 1465 described this time as her sacred stillness, a pause in the demands of her day where her mind shone like polished glass. A merchant's ledger from the same century reveals accounts carefully tallied at these hours. with a note that his mind felt sharper for numbers under the hush of night. What we might dismiss as insomnia was, for them, a golden window. For clarity, literature and records confirm this pattern again and again. Geoffrey Chaucer, in the Canterbury Tales, referenced characters rising between sleeps to begin adventures. Household manuals recommended midnight tasks suited to the mind's clarity, quiet conversation, prayer, or gentle craft. Some even warned that thoughts during these hours carried greater weight, as the mind was most unclouded. In other words, people believed midnight musings were not idle chatter, but words touched with a special significance. Physicians of the age agreed. Medical texts claimed that rising between sleeps aided digestion, refreshed the mind, and even revealed hidden truths. One physician wrote that dreams occurring before the waking could hint at illnesses, and that the waking hour itself was ideal for reflecting on their meaning. Another prescribed gentle stretching, though amusingly, he warned against vigorous sword practice, suggesting that at least a few knights took midnight exercise too far. The original "don't work out before bed" warning was already alive in the 15th century. But the midnight hours were not purely practical, they were spiritual. Monks, whose lives were devoted to ordered prayer, used the watching hours as the holiest time of the night. Records from monasteries describe chants rising softly in unison beneath vaulted ceilings, their voices weaving through stone halls while the world outside remained utterly silent. In their belief, prayers offered in this window reached God with greater clarity. The darkness between sleeps was not empty, it was filled with meaning, a time when the soul was thought to be closest to divine presence, and it wasn't only in cloisters. Among ordinary people, this liminal time was sometimes called the watching hour. Neighbors spoke in hushed tones, children stirred and whispered before sinking back to sleep, while storytellers spun tales in shadows. These weren't interruptions to sleep, they were essential parts of life's rhythm. Unlike our age, where sleeplessness feels like a failure, medieval men and women found freedom in it. The night was theirs to use, not to fight. And in that candlelit hush between two halves of slumber, they built a world of work, prayer, and whispered intimacy that we can barely imagine today. To understand why medieval sleep felt so natural, we must step into their nights. Imagine a world where the sun sinks, and true darkness falls, not the dim glow of street lamps or the faint pulse of electronics, but a blackness so complete that the stars themselves become your only companions. Medieval people lived in a darkness that is nearly impossible for us to fathom today. No neon signs, no car headlights, not even the constant hum of a city skyline. Artificial light was rare and precious. A single beeswax candle might cost a day's wages, and tallow candles, though cheaper, filled a room with thick smoke and foul odor. Light was not a commodity to be wasted, it was an inheritance. Some wills even listed partly used candles as items of value, bequeathed like jewelry or livestock. One quarrel in York grew heated over a half-burned beeswax candle, sparking as much drama as land or coin. Such was the worth of illumination. Most households owned only a few candles at a time, carefully rationed for prayer, writing, or essential tasks. Fires in the hearth glowed dimly, but even those were banked low at night to conserve wood. When curfew bells rang in towns, streets fell into darkness. By law, unnecessary lights were forbidden, both to prevent fire and to preserve the sanctity of night. In 1486, one city decree read, "He who wastes light at night steals sleep from his neighbors." Light pollution was not just frowned upon, it was criminal. In this deep dark, the human body thrived. Without constant exposure to glowing screens, people received pure doses of melatonin, the hormone that governs sleep. Their cycles matched the setting and rising of the sun, aligning perfectly with nature. Sleep physicians today tell us that artificial light can suppress melatonin by up to 85%, and modern insomnia is often the result. Medieval men and women needed no such reminders. Their darkness was a medicine, untainted and restorative. But darkness was more than a biological aid, it was a cultural force. People trained their senses to live within it. They recognized neighbors by the sound of footsteps. Hunters learned to distinguish animals by the rustle of leaves. Night watchmen claimed they could tell the hour by the songs of insects and birds. Architects, too, adapted to this reality. Homes were designed with light wells and reflective plaster walls to amplify the smallest flicker of daylight. Some wealthy homes included niches called light cups, curved recesses that multiplied the glow of a single flame. Monasteries took darkness especially seriously. Dormitories were carefully arranged to prevent stray light from disturbing sleep. Some even appointed keepers of the dark, monks whose nightly duty was to patrol, ensuring no unauthorized candles or oil lamps were lit. These medieval guardians of sleep treated darkness itself as holy, a condition to be protected with vigilance, and it shaped commerce. Many goods carried a darkness price, a surcharge if sold after sunset, simply because of the candles needed to conduct the trade. A merchant who offered night services could demand higher payment. Knowing the scarcity of light made his goods rarer and more valuable. For bakers, smiths, and brewers, those who could work by firelight held a certain prestige. Though few risked their eyesight on delicate crafts, yet perhaps the most striking legacy of medieval darkness was the peace it brought. There was no endless battle against glowing distractions, no blue-lit anxiety stealing rest from weary minds. Instead, silence and blackness wrapped the world like a blanket, forcing people to surrender, to breathe, to let their bodies rest. In that absence of light, their sleep was deep, unbroken, and profoundly healing. It was as if the night itself was medicine prescribed by nature, enforced by law, and cherished by all who knew its value. A medicine we in our glowing cities have almost entirely lost. If the medieval night gave people darkness, it also gave them warmth, not from stoves or central heating, but from one another. To us, the idea may sound unsettling, sharing a bed with strangers. Yet in the Middle Ages, it was custom, law, and simple necessity. At inns, bed sharing wasn't optional, it was enforced. A case from York records an innkeeper fined for offering separate beds when chambers weren't full. The magistrate's ruling was blunt. It is against custom, and wastes good firewood to heat multiple chambers when one will suffice. To medieval minds, refusing to share was selfish, almost absurd. Why squander resources when you could share warmth? Travelers often woke to find themselves pressed against strangers, sometimes to their delight, sometimes not. A merchant once grumbled that his bedfellow snored with the force of a shipman's horn, keeping the entire chamber awake. The innkeeper's solution? Charge him extra for the privilege of sleeping alone. The first noise cancellation fee in history. But beyond inns, bed sharing was woven into domestic life. Most homes had no heated bedrooms at all. The main fire was in the central hall. Once its embers dimmed, rooms grew frigid. Body heat became the cheapest, most reliable furnace. Household manuals even described ideal sleeping arrangements. The youngest, who generated the most warmth, placed in the middle. The elderly, more fragile, on the outer edges. Children became living hot water bottles, the warm core of the medieval family bed. Monks, too, followed rules for communal sleeping. Monastic records describe dormitories where 2 or 3 brothers lay side by side, with fines imposed for excessive nocturnal wandering. One set of rules humorously warned Brother Thomas to control his limbs or face spiritual consequence. The medieval solution to restless sleepers was penance. Even the design of beds reflected this shared existence. A merchant's bed in the 15th century might stretch 8 feet wide, large enough to hold 4 adults. Beds were shorter too, as people often slept propped upright, believing lying flat invited bad dreams or worse, death itself. Bed frames became gathering places, not just for rest but for whispered confidences, hushed laughter, and even business deals struck in the dark. Children rarely slept alone. Instead, they crowded together, learning from an early age the rhythm of sharing space. Medieval parenting guides warned that solitude bred selfishness, while communal sleeping encouraged strength and character. Imagine 6 siblings bundled under one wool blanket, each jostling for comfort, each shaping memories in the warmth of nightly companionship. Of course, the arrangement was not always blissful. Disputes over stolen blankets and midnight kicks were common. Records even mention lawsuits. One merchant complained that his bedfellow sang sea shanties in his sleep, with such vigor that no rest could be had. Some inns adapted by creating snorers' chambers, special rooms reserved for the loudest sleepers. Others matched travelers by habits, early risers with bakers, heavy sleepers with late-night merchants. A medieval version of roommate matching. Apps complete with blanket tugger categories. Yet, despite the quarrels, there was something profoundly human about this practice. In the warmth of shared beds, loneliness melted. The night became less threatening, more communal. Even physicians of the period wrote that solitary sleep breeds solitary thoughts, but shared sleep brings shared peace. For them, the cure for melancholy might simply be climbing into bed beside another soul. Today, we view privacy as a luxury. Medieval people would have found it odd, even dangerous. To them, the night was a time for togetherness, for shared breath and warmth. And in the vast silence of the medieval dark, the communal bed was not just a necessity, it was an anchor, a place where survival and intimacy merged beneath the same blanket. When we imagine medieval beds, it is tempting to picture lords reclining on feather mattresses draped in silk. The truth, however, was far simpler and far more ingenious. Most people slept on straw. A wooden frame was filled with fresh stalks, known as a straw tick, and while it may sound crude to us, these beds carried surprising benefits. They were breathable in summer, warm in winter, and most importantly renewable. Every harvest season, families replaced their bedding with fresh straw. Household records from the 5th-10th century show the ritual was so ingrained that old straw was carried out ceremoniously, then recycled as mulch or animal feed. Wealthier homes often replaced their straw monthly. When noble household wrote in its accounts, "Fresh straw brings fresh dreams." A charming motto, but also a practical truth. The art of bed-making was no small matter. Straw was not simply piled in, it was layered carefully for firmness, with professional bedmakers developing reputations for their craft. One man in London, known only as Thomas the Soft Layer, charged premium prices for his ability to arrange straw into a bed so comfortable it rivaled feather down. His technique, locals said, was worth its weight in wheat. These straw mattresses were surprisingly versatile. In summer, loosely packed straw allowed air to circulate. In winter, it was packed tightly for insulation. Some households even kept multiple straw types, wheat for summer, rye for winter, while oat straw was avoided for attracting mice. There were even straw inspectors in some towns, whose job was to prevent merchants from selling inferior stocks disguised as premium wheat. The bedding trade had its own guardians of quality. Feather beds did exist, but they were costly luxuries. Worse, they came with enemies: bedbugs, lice, fleas. One noble family complained bitterly of perpetual warfare with pests that feast upon our feathers. A frustrated merchant, after abandoning his feather bed, wrote that he returned to straw, declaring it firmer, cleaner, and less alive. In many ways, the humble straw tick proved healthier for the spine too. Medical texts noted that complaints of back pain were less frequent among those who slept on straw compared to those indulging in soft feather beds. There was also creativity in how straw beds were enhanced. Herbs were often layered between the stalks: lavender for calm, mint to deter pests, rosemary believed to chase away nightmares. Hospitals prescribed beds with different densities depending on the ailment: soft straw for fever patients, firmer for those with weak backs. Some even grew special fields of straw just for bedding. Straw beds were so integrated into daily life that language itself absorbed them. To hit the hay was quite literal. In the thick of it, originally described lying deep in a well-packed mattress and needle in a haystack, a phrase likely born from the exasperated sighs of women who lost sewing needles in their bedding. Monasteries recorded strict rules for bed upkeep. Weekly turning of straw was mandatory, with old straw burned rather than reused, lest fragments of dreams cling and confuse the soul. A poetic, if peculiar, form of spiritual recycling. Courts even heard cases involving fraudulent bedmakers. One man, caught stuffing river reeds in place of straw, was sentenced to sleep a month on his own deceitful mattress. In its rustling simplicity, the straw bed embodied medieval pragmatism. It was affordable, sustainable, and surprisingly effective. The sound of shifting stalks was even thought to soothe restless sleepers, like nature's lullaby. Long before memory foam and spring coils, medieval families found comfort in a bed that grew in their own fields, woven from the same stalks that fed their animals and filled their roofs. It wasn't just a bed. It was part of a living cycle, a link between harvest and hearth, rest and renewal. The medieval mattress was as much about community and season as it was about sleep. And perhaps, in its earthy simplicity, it offered a kind of rest that our expensive engineered beds can never truly replicate. If medieval people had a secret for falling asleep, they also had a secret for waking up. They didn't fight nature, they followed it. Where we jolt awake to buzzing alarms and glowing screens, they stirred gently with the first signs of dawn. Guided by bells, roosters, and the rhythms of their own bodies, the day began not with strict hours, but with light. In summer, dawn came as early as 4 o'clock, in winter as late as 7, and the rhythm of life adjusted accordingly. Monasteries kept order with bells that rang at daybreak, summoning monks to prayer. But even these bells were less intrusive than our alarms. They were expected, woven into daily life, anticipated by bodies already beginning to stir. Roosters were the second alarm clock, and not just on farms. Town records show that even city households kept them, prized as living timekeepers. Sometimes, however, they were too efficient. One case tells of a merchant suing his neighbor because the rooster crowed an hour before even God was ready to rise. The judge dismissed the case, reminding the merchant that nature could not be fined. The rooster, after all, had no master but the dawn. Architecture, too, was designed around this natural waking. Many beds were placed near east-facing windows, so the morning light would fall directly across sleepers' faces. Wealthy houses even had specialized windows, crafted to funnel the first rays into chambers. Nature itself was an alarm clock, soft but undeniable. The rustle of animals, the chorus of birds, the gradual brightening of the world, together they nudged people awake without violence, without panic. Monks developed what they called gradual awakening. The first brother to stir would begin. Quiet prayers, the scrape of his sandals across the stone floor, becoming a gentle cue for others to rise. One abbey praised the gentle riser who woke his brothers not with noise, but with kindness. In their belief, the body should be led, not dragged, from the world of dreams. Work followed this rhythm naturally. Fields were tended when the sun allowed, crafts began when light was sufficient, and labor started within an hour of sunrise. Being late was not measured by the clock, but by readiness and light. One judge, dismissing a dispute about tardiness, simply ruled, "The sun decides, not the clock." Even armies respected this natural rhythm. Records show that commanders often delayed marches until soldiers had awakened on their own. One captain observed that men who wake by their own accord fight better than those shaken from dreams. Though, he noted wryly, This made surprise dawn attacks all the more effective against them. Children, too, were allowed to rise naturally. Schools often began later in winter, waiting for daylight, and physicians cautioned parents against forcing early rising, believing it dulled the mind. Hospitals followed a similar practice. Patients were rarely woken unless treatment required it. One set of guidelines even forbade disturbing patients' rest, with the simple wisdom: the body heals best when it wakes of its own accord. Contrast this with our world of shrill alarms, rushed mornings, and frantic commutes. Medieval people knew no such panic. Their waking was gradual, natural, woven seamlessly into the world around them. The sun, the birds, the bells together. They pulled them gently from slumber. Perhaps their greatest insight was simple: the sun never failed to wake those who trusted it. If darkness and rhythm set the stage for medieval sleep, herbs provided the finishing touch. Instead of swallowing pills or scrolling through natural remedy forums, people in the Middle Ages turned to gardens. Monks, apothecaries, and even ordinary households grew herbs not for seasoning alone, but for rest. Sleep was coaxed gently from nature's pharmacy. Monasteries cultivated what were known as sleep gardens. In Yorkshire, one such cloister recorded 15 different varieties of herbs dedicated specifically to easing rest. Lavender, chamomile, hops, valerian, rose petals, mint, and more. These were not random experiments. Over generations, monks tested combinations, observing which worked best for sleeplessness, troubled dreams, or early waking. The results were compiled into manuscripts like the Knight's Comfort, where a monk proudly described his peaceful dreams. Blend lavender mixed with chamomile and a mysterious plant he called star's breath, likely borage. These remedies were taken in many forms: teas brewed warm, oils rubbed into the temples, sachets stuffed with dried herbs and slipped into pillows. Lavender was the favorite, calming on its own, stronger when paired with rose petals for anxiety or chamomile for racing thoughts. Rosemary and mint were believed to sharpen the mind for those who needed to wake early, while hops and valerian were prescribed for those who could not fall back asleep. Even the act of harvesting was ritualized. Some plants were gathered only under moonlight, others only at certain seasons. Apothecaries believed the time of collection gave the plant its power. Records even mention a herbalist fined for harvesting valerian root in spring instead of autumn, accused of weakening God's gift with impatience. Households, too, took part in these practices. Poorer families kept simple remedies: mint, chamomile, perhaps rosemary. Wealthy estates went further, importing exotic herbs from Constantinople or Venice. Yet, ironically, stewards often grumbled that my lady's chamomile, though common, works as well as her costly imports. Pillow sachets became especially popular. Small cloth bags filled with dried herbs were tucked under heads, scenting dreams with calm. Hospitals scented entire wards mint in fever rooms, lavender in recovery halls. A physician's notes from Paris even describe applying rosemary oil to the feet of anxious patients, writing that the calm travels upward through the body. The trade in sleep herbs formed its own economy. Professional gatherers roamed fields, while herb dryers perfected the art of preserving plants for winter use. One apothecary complained in his notebook that customers would pay dearly for ale, but haggle for lavender, a frustration modern pharmacists might understand. Monasteries, ever inventive, created what we might call the first sleep clinics. Travelers could spend nights within cloisters, given herb-infused teas, quiet surroundings, and a strict rhythm of rest. Some came from 50 miles away, seeking treatment, though one monk dryly noted that the journey itself often exhausted patients into perfect sleep. And so the medieval world trusted its gardens. No pills, no chemical sedatives, no glowing screens disrupting their cycles. Just earth, leaves, and blossoms, gathered with care and brewed with faith. Their wisdom was simple. Sleep was not forced, it was invited. If herbs soothed the mind toward sleep, mealtimes ensured the body cooperated. One of the most overlooked secrets of medieval slumber was simply this: they did not eat at night. Not because of diet trends nor self-discipline, but because they couldn't. With no refrigeration, no gas stoves, no electric lamps, food preparation after dark was nearly impossible. And so, by necessity, they stumbled into a practice modern science now praises fasting before bed. Medieval life revolved around two meals. The main meal, dinner, happened at midday when the sun stood highest. Supper followed in late afternoon, when shadows stretched twice as long as the objects that cast them. After that, the fires were banked, kitchens fell silent, and the day's eating ended. Monasteries were strict about this. At vespers, the evening bell, the kitchen fires had to die, no matter who remained hungry. One abbey's records phrase it bluntly: when vespers ring, the fires must sleep. No exceptions, physicians supported the rule. Medical texts warned that late eating caused troubled dreams and sluggish mornings. One doctor wrote, "Those who sup after the sun has retired wake with minds as cloudy as morning mist." Another claimed that nightmares followed a belly filled after dark. These warnings weren't moral scolding. They were keen observations, born of generations who noticed that heavy meals and peaceful sleep did not mix. Guilds enforced similar customs. Carpenters fined members for eating too close to bedtime, declaring that a full belly makes clumsy hands at dawn. Inns, too, held firm boundaries. Travelers arriving late might find only ale waiting for them, no food. One innkeeper, dragged into court for denying guests a hot supper, defended himself by saying, "Kitchens, like chickens, must rest when the sun does." His wit amused the magistrates enough to dismiss the case. Even social gatherings avoided. Food at night. Hospitality after dark meant conversation, music, or drink, not feasting. A host who laid out heavy dishes after sunset was seen as either showing off or breaking custom. Evening was for fellowship, not indulgence. In fact, etiquette guides warned guests not to expect meals after supper, lest they embarrass their host. Architecture itself reflected this rhythm. Kitchens were often built separately from sleeping chambers, partly to prevent fire, but also to discourage midnight raids. Some noble households even recorded in building notes that the kitchen should be far enough from chambers to prevent wanderings. In other words, even the wealthy couldn't be trusted near a pantry in the night. For farmers, the rhythm tied to chores reinforced the habit. By the time the animals were secured and tools put away, darkness had settled. Fires were low, the kitchen cold. Eating late wasn't just unhealthy, it was impractical. In towns, bakers might rise before dawn to prepare dough, but they too worked on an empty stomach, eating only after the ovens were filled. This fasting, born of necessity, gave medieval people a powerful advantage. With empty stomachs, their bodies fell quickly into deep, undisturbed sleep. Healing was faster, rest was fuller. Hospital records even noted that patients who kept to the natural hours of eating recovered better than those who did not. And so every evening, when the last meal ended and the kitchen fire dimmed, the medieval household closed its day with finality. No midnight snacks, no restless digestion. Just silence, darkness, and the steady drift into sleep. If medieval people fell asleep easily, it wasn't just because of herbs or darkness or supper schedules. It was because their bodies were tired in ways most of us can hardly imagine. Daily life itself was a workout. A farmer walked 10 miles behind a plow, pushing against stubborn earth. Blacksmiths hammered steel for hours, their arms trembling from the weight of iron. Weavers stood at looms all day, moving back and forth until their shoes wore thin. Even bread making was exercise, 30 minutes of kneading dough until sweat beaded on brows. Without realizing it, medieval people lived in a permanent state of functional fitness. Children carried water from wells, hauled firewood, herded animals. Apprentices climbed endless stairs with heavy loads on their backs. Soldiers marched, nobles hunted, and peasants labored from dawn until dusk. And when the sun finally set, exhaustion was not a problem, it was a guarantee. Few lay awake worrying whether they were tired enough to sleep. Their bodies answered that question for them, yet perhaps the greatest difference between their sleep and ours was not physical but mental. Medieval people did not obsess over rest. They didn't track it, analyze it, or fret about its quality. There were no sleep gurus, no morning podcasts about optimizing REM cycles. They treated sleep like breathing, something natural, unremarkable, and inevitable. A merchant's diary captures this perfectly. Amid notes about wool prices and travel plans, he mentions sleeping on sacks of grain when no bed was available wheat. Sacks being softer than barley, he noted with casual preference. No complaints about firmness, no anxiety over hours slept. Just rest taken when needed. Another record from an innkeeper catalogs the most common guest complaints: hard beds, noisy roosters, snoring travelers. Not a single mention of insomnia. The greatest problem was oversleeping and missing breakfast. Even medical texts reflected this attitude. Physicians wrote extensively about fevers, toothaches, even wandering spleens. But sleep disorders? They were barely mentioned. One doctor's simple prescription for sleeplessness reads, "Let them stack hay until their arms grow heavy." No meditation, no potions, just honest fatigue. Monks, too, treated sleep with a kind of gentle indifference. If one dozed off during long night prayers, the abbot might simply move him closer to the front, where a nudge from a brother could rouse him. At one monastery, a clever monk devised a system of subtle elbow jabs to keep his fellows awake. Sleep was not a crisis to be solved, but a natural force to be respected and worked around. Perhaps this was their real wisdom. They did not make sleep a project. They didn't turn it into a measurement of success or a source of anxiety. For them, sleep was simply part of life's flow, no more complicated than eating or walking. They accepted it as it came, and in doing so, they rested more deeply than many of us can imagine. Modern science now rediscovers what they lived without: effort. That worrying about sleep is one of the surest ways to lose it. Medieval people never carried this burden. Their nights were dark, their bodies weary, their minds untroubled. And in that state of peace, they slept. The medieval world teaches us that perfect sleep is not found in gadgets, routines, or endless self-help advice. It lies in rhythm, in darkness, in work, in fellowship, and above all, in the simplicity of letting go. For them, sleep was not broken. Only we have broken it.